Hello there, Ancient Earth documentary here. There's a moment in every disaster movie where the camera pulls back, revealing the scale of destruction. Cities crumbling, oceans boiling, skies turning black. Then the credits roll, leaving you wondering what comes next. But here's the thing about Earth's real disasters. The camera never stops rolling. The planet doesn't fade to black. And what comes after is often stranger than the catastrophe itself. 90% of everything alive can vanish in what geologists casually call an instant. That instant might span 10,000 years, maybe 100,000. On a planet that's been spinning for 4.5 billion years, that's not even a heartbeat. It's a snap, a blink. And then the world you knew is gone. This isn't speculation. It's happened 5 times. 5 separate moments when Earth essentially hit the reset button. 5 times when the rules of survival stopped making sense. When being perfectly adapted meant nothing. When dominance was no shield against extinction. The trilobites learned this lesson. So did the dinosaurs. So did countless species whose names we'll never know because they vanished before we could dig them up. Right now, scientists are tracking something that makes those ancient catastrophes feel uncomfortably relevant. Species are disappearing faster than at any point in the last 66 million years. Not from asteroids or supervolcanoes. From us. Our cities. Our farms. Our appetite for fossil fuels. We might be creating the conditions for extinction number 6. The difference this time is we're not hiding in burrows hoping to survive. We're the rock from space. Understanding what happened during those 5 previous resets isn't just an exercise in deep time. It's a mirror. Each extinction tells us something about how planetary systems break down, about which survival strategies work when everything goes wrong, about what emerges from the ruins, and most importantly, about whether we're looking at history or prophecy. Before diving into the extinctions themselves, we need to establish what we're actually talking about. What separates a bad millennium from a genuine mass extinction? The threshold is both precise and terrifying. At least 75% of all species on Earth must disappear in what qualifies as geologically short time. Not individuals, not populations, entire species. Every member, every genetic lineage, every evolutionary experiment that took millions of years to develop, simply erased. Think about that number for a moment. 3/4 of all species. Imagine walking through a forest where 3 out of every 4 types of trees, insects, birds, and mammals have vanished. That's not a forest anymore. It's a graveyard with a few confused survivors wandering through the wreckage. But how do we even know this happened hundreds of millions of years ago? The answer lies in rocks, specifically in what those rocks no longer contain. Paleontologists study sedimentary layers like pages in a book. Each layer represents a slice of time. The fossils trapped inside show us who was alive back then. Most layers tell a story of stability. Species come and go at a steady background rate. New forms emerge. Old ones fade. It's evolution's normal rhythm, the steady tick of change that happens constantly. Then you hit certain layers where that rhythm shatters. Entire groups of organisms that dominated the layer below simply aren't in the layer above. Not rare, not declining, absent. It's like flipping through a family photo album and suddenly finding pages where most of the people have been cut out. They were there, then they weren't. These boundaries in the rock record are called extinction horizons. Scientists can date them using radioactive isotopes. They can analyze chemical signatures to understand environmental conditions. They can track which lineages disappeared and which survived. When you do this work carefully across sites around the world, a pattern emerges. Earth's history isn't a smooth story. It's punctuated by sudden catastrophes. The difference between normal extinction and mass extinction is like comparing a house fire to a firestorm that consumes an entire city. During background extinction, maybe 1 species out of every million goes extinct each year. barely noticeable against the constant emergence of new forms. During a mass extinction, that rate explodes. Hundreds or thousands of species vanishing annually, entire ecosystems collapsing within millennia. What really unsettles geologists is how these events don't just kill. They restructure which types of life can succeed on Earth. Before an extinction, certain groups dominate. They've spent millions of years perfecting their strategies. Then the world changes, and all those perfect adaptations become death sentences. The survivors aren't necessarily the strongest or smartest. They're the lucky ones who happen to have traits that worked in the new reality. After each mass extinction, Earth essentially reboots. Survivors spread into empty niches. They evolve rapidly to fill vacant roles. New dominant groups emerge that never could have competed with the old guard. Evolution gets a fresh start, exploring possibilities that were blocked before. This is why mass extinctions matter beyond the death toll. They're creation events. They're the reason mammals inherited Earth from dinosaurs. They're the reason dinosaurs inherited it from the mammal-like reptiles before them. They're moments when evolution's direction changes completely. Throughout Earth's long history, life has faced 5 catastrophes severe enough to earn the title mass extinction. Paleontologists call them the Big Five. 5 moments when the planet came closer to being sterilized than at any other time in the past 500 million years. Each one had different causes. Each one killed in different ways. Each one reset the biological clock and sent evolution spinning toward unexpected destinations. But they all share certain patterns that become disturbingly relevant when you look at what's happening today. The first great dying occurred so long ago that the world would be unrecognizable to modern eyes. The second happened when life was still mostly confined to oceans, just beginning to experiment with land. The third came closest to ending complex life entirely, an event so catastrophic it makes the others look like minor setbacks. The fourth cleared the stage for the age of dinosaurs, and the fifth, the most famous, ended that age with apocalyptic finality. Each extinction teaches us something crucial about how planetary catastrophes unfold, about tipping points in climate systems, about feedback loops that amplify destruction, about which survival strategies work when normal rules no longer apply. This knowledge isn't just academic, it's desperately practical. Because we're living through what many scientists are calling the 6th extinction. Right now, species are disappearing at rates that rival the Big Five. But this time, there's no asteroid, no supervolcano. The culprit is staring back at us from mirrors. Unlike trilobites or dinosaurs, we can see it coming. We can understand the mechanisms. We can study past extinctions to predict future ones. That doesn't guarantee we'll act wisely, but it means we can. It means that when we talk about the 6th extinction, we're not just describing an inevitable fate. We're holding a choice. Every previous extinction was written by geology and orbital mechanics. Slow continental drift, gradual carbon buildup, rare accidents from space. They were brutal but simple. 1 or 2 major drivers pushing systems past their limits. This time is different. For the first time in 4.5 billion years, one species is pulling multiple extinction triggers simultaneously. Climate warming, ocean acidification, habitat destruction, chemical pollution, invasive species. Each force alone would stress ecosystems. Combined, they create something unprecedented. Human activity is stacking the deck in ways no asteroid ever could. And we're doing it faster than any natural catastrophe in the geological record. The carbon we're releasing took nature tens of thousands of years to pump into the atmosphere during previous warming events. We've done it in about 150 years. The graph doesn't slope upward. It spikes, almost vertical. Biology has a concept for this: rate. Not just how much the world changes, but how fast. Life can survive astonishing transformations if they happen slowly enough. Forests migrate, species shift ranges, evolution experiments. But when change outruns adaptation, the web tears. Species that can't move quickly enough simply disappear. So as we examine these 5 previous resets, we're not just looking backward, we're looking sideways at our own moment. Every extinction tells us something about tipping points, about feedback loops, about which adaptations help when normal strategies fail. And every extinction reminds us that dominance is temporary. Success is no guarantee of survival. The planet always keeps one more catastrophe in reserve. The first extinction we need to understand happened 445 million years ago. So far back that even the rocks have mostly been destroyed by time. This was a world before forests, before insects, before anything remotely familiar walked on land. To understand what died, we need to picture what lived. The continents were barren rock. No grass, no trees, no animals, just stone, sand, and silence. But turn toward the ocean and you'd see something extraordinary. The seas were absolutely teeming with life. Not life as we know it today, but something alien and wonderful. The dominant creatures were trilobites. Imagine horseshoe crabs, but thousands of species ranging from fingernail-sized to dinner plate-sized. They crawled across the ocean floor in vast herds, their segmented bodies protected by thick armor, their compound eyes scanning for food and danger. Above them swam nautiloids, ancient relatives of modern squids. But these weren't small. Some species had shells 15 feet long, straight as spears, propelling through water like living torpedoes. They were apex predators, the T-Rexes of the Ordovician seas, hunting with tentacles that darted from massive shells. The seafloor itself was covered with gardens, not plants but animals. Crinoids, sometimes called sea lilies, though they're actually relatives of starfish. They grew in dense forests, feathery arms filtering microscopic food from currents, swaying like underwater flowers. Millions of them covering continental shelves, creating ecosystems more diverse than anything on land would be for hundreds of millions of years. Life had figured out how to build elaborate body plans, develop specialized organs, create predator-prey relationships that drove increasing sophistication. The oceans were warm. Carbon dioxide levels were high. Sea levels were at some of the highest points in Earth's history, creating massive shallow platforms where marine life exploded in diversity. There were more types of marine creatures then than ever before. Life wasn't just surviving. It was flourishing, experimenting, filling every possible role. And then without warning, everything started dying. It began subtly. Ocean temperatures started dropping. Not everywhere at once, not catastrophically at first, but steadily, year by year, century by century. The warm currents that had circulated for millions of years began weakening. The shallow tropical seas started cooling. Trilobites noticed first. These creatures had thrived in warm waters for tens of millions of years. Their entire physiology was optimized for tropical conditions. As temperatures dropped just a few degrees, their metabolism slowed. Reproduction rates declined. Eggs that should have hatched didn't. Juveniles that should have reached maturity died before reproducing. But the real killer wasn't cold itself. It was what cold was doing to the ocean. Far to the south, on the ancient supercontinent Gondwana, something unprecedented was happening. Ice was forming, not just winter ice that melted each spring, but permanent glaciers that grew year after year. Snow accumulated in the southern highlands, compressing into ice that refused to retreat. The ice spread outward, flowing downhill like frozen rivers, covering larger areas with each passing century. What started as seasonal snowpack became something Earth hadn't experienced since complex life evolved. A true ice age, and it was about to reshape everything. The glaciers grew with mathematical precision. Each winter added layers. Each summer failed to melt them away. The white sheets reflected sunlight back to space, cooling the air above them, ensuring more snow would fall and less would melt. A feedback loop had begun, one that wouldn't stop until something fundamental changed. As ice sheets thickened across Gondwana, they locked up staggering quantities of water. Millions of cubic kilometers that had once circulated through oceans were now frozen solid on land. The ocean basins began to empty, not overnight, but steadily, relentlessly. Sea levels dropped. In geological terms, this happened fast. Over perhaps 200,000 years, the oceans fell by 90 meters, maybe more in some regions. To put that in perspective, imagine draining every shallow sea around every continent simultaneously. The continental shelves, those underwater platforms where sunlight penetrates and life explodes, began emerging above the waves. For the creatures living there, this was apocalyptic. The habitat they'd evolved in for millions of years was vanishing, not because something killed them directly, but because their world was simply disappearing, evaporating into the southern ice. Trilobites crawling across what had been comfortable shallow sea floor suddenly found themselves in deeper, colder water. The warm currents that had bathed the continental shelves weakened. Food became scarce. The microscopic organisms that formed the base of the food web couldn't thrive in these new conditions. Without them, everything higher up the chain began to starve. Competition intensified as populations compressed into shrinking habitable zones. Predators found prey concentrated in tighter spaces, but that prey was already weakened, already struggling. The nautiloids hunted desperately in waters too deep, too cold, too different from what their ancestors had known. And it wasn't just habitat loss. The cold itself was deadly. These creatures had evolved for warm water. Their enzymes, their metabolism, their reproductive cycles, everything was optimized for tropical conditions. Drop the temperature by 5 degrees and eggs stopped developing properly. Drop it by 10 and adults moved slower, fed less efficiently, became vulnerable. Within a few 100,000 years, roughly 60% of all marine genera disappeared. Not species genera. Entire evolutionary lineages erased. Whole branches of the tree of life cut away and discarded. The seafloor that had been covered in dense forests of crinoids became bare rock. The reefs that had stretched for hundreds of kilometers crumbled. As the organisms building them died faster than new polyps could grow, the water itself changed chemistry as temperature and salinity shifted. But extinction events rarely follow a simple script. Just when the survivors began adapting, just when the remaining species started evolving tolerance for cold water and low oxygen, the climate reversed. The ice melted. Fast. Whatever had triggered the glaciation, whether continental drift moving Gondwana off the pole, changes in ocean circulation, or something else entirely, it stopped. The southern hemisphere warmed. The massive ice sheets that had taken hundreds of thousands of years to build collapsed in what was, geologically, an instant. All that locked up water rushed back into the oceans. Sea levels rose rapidly, flooding the continental shelves again. You'd think this would be good news for marine life. The shallow seas returning, warm water spreading, habitat restored. But nothing in nature is that simple. The flooding water was different. As it swept across newly exposed land, it carried enormous loads of nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen that had been locked in rocks, organic matter that had accumulated during the Ice Age, all of it washed into the seas in massive pulses. The oceans responded with algae blooms, explosive growths of microscopic plants that turned vast stretches of water green. At first glance, this looked like abundance. More photosynthesis, more food at the base of the chain, more life. But algae blooms are ecological time bombs. When they die, they sink. Bacteria decompose them on the seafloor. And decomposition consumes oxygen. Lots of oxygen. More oxygen than the water can replenish through mixing with the atmosphere. Dead zones formed. Anoxic regions where dissolved oxygen dropped to levels too low to support complex life. Fish swimming into these zones suffocated. Trilobites crawling across the bottom simply stopped moving as their gills found nothing to extract from the water. Nautiloids hunting near the seafloor surfaced desperately, but the oxygen depletion often extended through the entire water column. The species that had survived the first extinction pulse by adapting to cold water now faced a second, completely different challenge: rapid warming, toxic algae blooms, oxygen-depleted waters, chemical changes they had no evolutionary preparation for. This second pulse was the killing blow. When it finally ended, 85% of all marine species were extinct. The Ordovician seas that had been so vibrant, so diverse, so full of evolutionary experimentation, were nearly empty. The great nautiloid predators vanished. Most trilobite families disappeared forever. The graptolite colonies that had drifted through open water in their billions were gone. The brachiopods that had covered every rock surface became rare. The crinoid forests were reduced to scattered survivors. What caused this? The proximate cause, the immediate trigger, seems clear. Glaciation. But why did glaciation happen when it did? The simplest explanation involves continental drift. Gondwana, that ancient southern supercontinent, drifted over the South Pole. When large landmasses sit at high latitudes, ice accumulates. This creates runaway cooling. Ice reflects sunlight. Reflected sunlight means less heat absorbed. Less heat means more ice. More ice means more reflection. The cycle feeds itself until something breaks it. But some researchers propose something more dramatic happened first. Something that made the glaciation possible by destabilizing Earth's climate in the first place. The gamma-ray burst hypothesis. Controversial, difficult to prove, but tantalizing. Gamma-ray bursts are the most energetic events in the universe. When massive stars collapse into black holes, they emit beams of intense radiation. If one of these beams swept across Earth from a star within a few thousand light years, the effects would be catastrophic in ways that leave almost no direct evidence. The burst would strip away part of the ozone layer. This wouldn't kill everything immediately, but without ozone protection, ultraviolet radiation from our own sun would pour through the atmosphere unchecked. UV radiation penetrates shallow water. It would devastate phytoplankton, the microscopic organisms at the base of the entire marine food web. Kill the phytoplankton and the whole system collapses from the bottom up. Fewer organisms photosynthesizing means less carbon dioxide absorbed from the atmosphere. Less CO. 2 absorption means atmospheric levels drop. Lower CO2 means less greenhouse warming. Less warming triggers ice formation. Ice formation triggers more cooling, and suddenly you're in a glaciation. The gamma-ray burst wouldn't directly cause the mass extinction. It would just tip the first domino. The rest would follow through purely natural feedback loops. Evidence for this is circumstantial. Some Ordovician rocks show signs of extensive UV damage to fossilized spores. But proving that damage came from a gamma-ray burst 445 million years ago is nearly impossible. The event itself would leave no crater, no impact debris, no chemical signature we could definitively identify. What we know with certainty is that something triggered rapid glaciation. The glaciation nearly emptied the oceans of complex life. And when it ended, the world that emerged was fundamentally different. But nearly empty isn't the same as completely empty. Extinction events are selective. They don't kill randomly. They create conditions where certain traits become advantageous and others become fatal. Some trilobite species possess tolerance for colder water. Maybe they'd evolved in deeper, cooler environments and happened to have the right adaptations when temperatures dropped. They survived. Some nautiloids could hunt in deeper oceans where the temperature swings were less extreme. They made it through. Brachiopods that could tolerate lower oxygen levels persisted in refuges where others suffocated. And some creatures thrived. Those primitive jawless fish that had been minor players in the Ordovician ecosystem suddenly found themselves in a world with far less competition. The nautiloid predators that had kept their populations in check were mostly gone. The ecological niches were empty, waiting to be filled. Over the next 50 million years, fish exploded in diversity. They evolved jaws, revolutionizing what they could eat. They developed better fins, more efficient swimming. They diversified into thousands of species, filling roles that trilobites and nautiloids had once dominated. The survivors of the Ordovician extinction became the ancestors of fish that would eventually crawl onto land. Those first tetrapods, those pioneers of terrestrial life, descended from fish that only got their chance because an ice age wiped out the competition. Without the extinction, the oceans might have remained dominated by trilobites and nautiloids indefinitely. Evolution had no reason to favour fish when other creatures already successfully filled every available role. But the extinction reset the board. It cleared away the established players and gave the underdogs their chance. This is what mass extinctions do. They're not just death events, they're creation events. They destroy the old order and make room for something new. They allow evolutionary experiments that would have failed in a crowded world to succeed in an empty one. The Ordovician-Silurian extinction was Earth's first great reset, the first time the planet demonstrated it could wipe the slate nearly clean and force life to start over. It wouldn't be the last. Not remotely close, but it established the pattern that would repeat 4 more times over the next 400 million years. Catastrophe, collapse, survival, radiation, transformation. Each reset would reshape which groups inherited the Earth. Each would create opportunities that hadn't existed before. And each would remind life that dominance is temporary, that adaptation is no guarantee against extinction when the rules themselves change. The survivors didn't win because they were superior. They won because they happened to have the right traits for a world nobody could have predicted. They were efficient where efficiency mattered, flexible where flexibility was needed, lucky where luck was the only thing that counted. And in the emptied oceans, those survivors began the slow work of rebuilding. Not restoring what had been lost, that world was gone forever, but creating something new from the wreckage. Within a few million years, the seas were full again. Different creatures in different roles, but full. Life had bounced back. The first reset was complete. Part 3. The Late Devonian Extinction. Forward 70 million years. The oceans have refilled. New reefs sprawl across the shallow seas, built not by the organisms that came before, but by entirely fresh lineages that evolved to fill those vacant spaces. Life hasn't just recovered. It's innovated, and for the first time in Earth's history, something extraordinary is happening on land. Picture standing on a Devonian shoreline 375 million years ago. Turn around. Behind you, forests rise. Not forests as you know them, not oak or pine or maple, but towering plants called Archaeopteris, stretching 30 meters high, their frond-like branches catching sunlight that had never been intercepted this way before. These are Earth's first true trees, and they're rewriting the rules. For billions of years, continents had been essentially naked rock. Bacteria formed thin crusts in damp places. Primitive mosses clung to stones near water, but nothing substantial, nothing that reached skyward, nothing that cast shadows across miles of landscape. Now, suddenly, forests turn back toward the ocean. The water teems with armoured fish called placoderms, some growing 6 meters long, their heads encased in bony plates like living tanks. Primitive sharks patrol deeper water. Ammonites with their spiral shells drift through the water column, and in the shallows, something revolutionary is occurring. The first tetrapods, 4-limbed vertebrates, are hauling themselves onto muddy banks, taking their inaugural steps on land. This is life at its most ambitious. The oceans are packed with diversity. The land is finally being colonized. Everything points toward accelerating complexity, toward a future of endless possibility. Then, over the span of 20 million years, 75% of all species vanish, not in one catastrophic moment. This extinction unfolds in waves, in pulses of death separated by brief recoveries. Each pulse pushes ecosystems to the brink. Survivors adapt. Then another wave hits. Then another. It's like watching someone try to climb out of a pit while someone else keeps filling it with water. Eventually, exhaustion wins. Scientists have identified at least 7 major extinction pulses during this period. The 2 largest, the Kellwasser events around 375 million years ago and the Hangenberg event around 359 million years ago, were particularly devastating. What made this extinction uniquely terrible wasn't cold or heat or asteroid impact. It was suffocation. Vast stretches of ocean were losing oxygen entirely, becoming anoxic zones where nothing could breathe. Imagine being a placoderm, one of those massive armored predators. You've swum these waters your entire life. You know every current, every hunting ground. Then one day, the water tastes wrong. Your gills work harder, pulling water through, but extracting less oxygen. You rise toward the surface seeking relief. It doesn't help. The oxygen isn't just scarce at depth, it's disappearing throughout the entire water column. Around you, other fish show the same distress. Gasping, swimming erratically, some floating belly up, their armored bodies gleaming uselessly in the filtered light. Below, the reef that has been vibrant with color and movement falls silent. Corals retract, sponges shut down. The entire ecosystem suffocates together. You survive this event. Barely. You find a pocket of better water closer to shore where waves mixing with atmosphere provide just enough oxygen. But the reef doesn't survive. Those corals that took millions of years to build their massive structures die en masse. Their skeletons remain as ghostly monuments. The living tissue that built them is gone. Then, just as oxygen levels begin returning to normal, it happens again. Another pulse of anoxia. Another wave of death. This pattern repeated for 20 million years. Recovery, collapse, recovery, collapse. Each time, more species disappeared. Each time, ecosystems became simpler, less diverse, less resilient. But what caused these oxygen crashes? The answer might surprise you. Look up, not down. Those forests spreading across continents, they were changing everything. Trees don't just sit passively on the surface. They send roots deep into soil, breaking apart rock, dissolving minerals, pulling out nutrients. This chemical weathering releases enormous amounts of phosphorus and nitrogen into the environment. And where do those nutrients go? Into rivers. From rivers into oceans. Now scale this up. Every continent simultaneously experiencing its first forests, millions of years of accumulated rock minerals washing into seas that had never received this influx before. The oceans suddenly get an enormous nutrient boost, particularly the exact elements that limit how much life can exist in water. In modern terms, we call this eutrophication. When agricultural runoff dumps excess nutrients into lakes, algae blooms explode. The water turns green with life. Then those algae die, sink, and bacterial decomposition consumes oxygen, lots of oxygen. Scale that to planetary levels. Massive algae blooms fertilized by forest runoff. Massive die-offs as blooms collapsed. Bacterial decomposition, consuming oxygen faster than waves and currents could replenish it. Anoxic zones spreading across thousands of miles of seafloor. Reef ecosystems were particularly vulnerable. Corals need clear, clean, oxygen-rich water. They can't survive algae blooms blocking sunlight. They can't tolerate low oxygen. They definitely can't handle the chemical changes accompanying anoxic conditions. The Great Devonian reefs collapsed within a few thousand years. Here's the staggering part. After the late Devonian extinction, reef ecosystems essentially disappeared for 100 million years. Not decades, not millennia. 100 million years. That's longer than the entire age of dinosaurs. Longer than the span from first mammals to present day. For 100 million years, oceans had no significant reefs. The ecological niche was simply gone, wiped clean. But forests aren't the only culprit scientists have identified. Evidence points to volcanic activity in what's now Siberia, releasing toxic gases. Others suggest asteroid impacts. At least 2 impact craters date to this period, though whether they caused extinctions or merely coincided with them remains unclear. The truth is, probably all of the above. A perfect storm. Volcanic eruptions pumping carbon dioxide and sulfur into atmosphere. Forests altering chemistry of runoff. Possible asteroid impacts delivering additional shocks. Each factor amplifying others, creating feedback loops pushing the planet into repeated crisis. Some researchers propose forests might have cooled the planet too effectively. By pulling carbon dioxide out through photosynthesis and weathering, they could have triggered global cooling. We know from the Ordovician that rapid climate swings kill marine life. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. While 75% of species were disappearing, while reefs collapsed, while oceans suffocated, one particular group thrived. Those early tetrapods, the first vertebrates learning to live on land, they were doing fine. The late Devonian extinction was primarily marine. Life on land, still relatively simple and sparse, was less affected. Those first 4-legged pioneers found themselves with new opportunities. As marine ecosystems collapsed, selection pressure favoured creatures that could survive in oxygen-poor water or, better yet, spend more time on land where oxygen was abundant. The tetrapods that made it through weren't just survivors. They were ancestors of every land vertebrate that would follow, every amphibian, every reptile, bird and mammal, every dinosaur that would walk Earth, every human who would one day look back trying to understand what happened during those dark 20 million years. In a sense, the late Devonian extinction was the disaster that made us possible. If reef ecosystems had remained dominant, if oceans stayed oxygen-rich, marine life might have remained evolution's pinnacle. But the prolonged oxygen crisis changed the rules. It made land the safer option, the place with a future. By the end of the Hangenberg event, around 359 million years ago, the world was transformed. The age of armoured fish was over. Great reefs were gone. Oceans were simpler, quieter, emptier. But on land, in shadows of those world-changing forests, tetrapods were diversifying. They didn't know it, but they were inheriting the planet. In another 100 million years, their descendants would dominate ecosystems Devonian fish could never have imagined. Yet Earth wasn't done resetting itself, not remotely close. The next extinction would make the late Devonian look like a minor setback. It would be so devastating, so thorough, so absolutely catastrophic that it would earn a name still sending chills through anyone studying Earth's history. They call it the Great Dying. Picture Earth 252 million years ago, not the Earth you know with familiar continents scattered across blue oceans. This was completely different. All landmasses had crashed together into one colossal supercontinent called Pangaea. From pole to pole, from eastern shore to western coast, you could theoretically walk across the entire world without getting your feet wet. And it was dying. Not slowly, not gradually. This was death on a scale, making every other extinction event look like a warm-up. By the time it ended, 96% of all marine species would be gone. 70% of land species extinct. Entire ecosystems would vanish so completely, we barely have fossil evidence they existed. This wasn't a reset. This was nearly complete shutdown. Earth came closer to becoming sterile rock than at any other point in its history. We call it the Permian-Triassic extinction. Geologists who study it have another name. The Great Dying. Here's what makes this terrifying. Not caused by an asteroid. No giant space rock slamming into the planet. No single catastrophic impact you could point to. and say that's what did it. This was worse, something that came from within Earth itself, something that once it started, couldn't be stopped. The Permian period had been relatively good times for life. The oceans were full of bizarre creatures. Trilobites, those armoured arthropods that had survived 300 million years, were still crawling across the seafloor. Massive reefs built by strange organisms called rugose corals stretched for thousands of miles. The seas teemed with fish, sharks, and enormous nautiloids, squid-like predators that grew up to 20 feet long. On land, things were even weirder. The ancestors of mammals were the dominant vertebrates, not dinosaurs. Those wouldn't evolve for millions of years. Instead, you had creatures like gorgonopsids, saber-toothed predators that looked like nightmares crossed between lions and reptiles. Huge herbivores the size of hippos browsed on tough vegetation. Insects buzzed through forests of primitive conifers and seed ferns. Life had conquered the land completely, spreading across Pangaea in all its strange and wonderful forms. Then, in what is now Siberia, the ground began to crack open. Not just a few volcanoes, not a single eruption. An area roughly the size of Europe started bleeding magma. Fissures hundreds of miles long opened up, pouring out lava in quantities that defy comprehension. Over the course of 1 million years, maybe less, these Siberian traps would vomit out enough lava to cover the entire United States in a layer of rock 500 feet thick. Think about that moment. 1 million years sounds like a long time from a human perspective. Geologically, it's nothing. It's instantaneous. And for every year of that million-year eruption, massive amounts of lava were flooding across the landscape, burying everything in its path, turning forests into charcoal, boiling rivers, creating visions of hell that would have impressed Dante. But the lava wasn't even the main problem. What killed the planet was what came with it. Every time magma forces its way to the surface, it brings gases: carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, hydrogen chloride, all the volatile compounds that have been dissolved in molten rock deep underground. During a normal volcanic eruption, you get a temporary spike in these gases, enough to affect local climate, maybe to cause some acid rain in the immediate area. Then it's over. The volcano goes dormant, and Earth's natural systems absorb and neutralize the gases over a few years or decades. The Siberian traps erupted for 1 million years. The gases didn't have time to be absorbed. They just kept accumulating, kept building up in the atmosphere, kept pushing Earth's climate further and further beyond any stable state. The sulfur dioxide hit first. Within years of the initial eruptions, it was combining with water vapor in the atmosphere to create sulfuric acid. Not in some laboratory, in the sky. Clouds became weapons. When it rained, it was acid rain so corrosive it could strip leaves off trees, kill fish in lakes and rivers, dissolve the shells of marine organisms. The oceans along the coast began turning acidic, making it impossible for anything with a calcium carbonate shell to survive. Entire reef systems began dissolving, literally melting into the increasingly hostile water. But that was just the beginning. The eruptions were so massive, so violent, that they were injecting chemicals directly into the stratosphere. Up there, 10 miles above the surface, sulfur compounds began reacting with ozone, destroying the protective layer that shields life from the sun's ultraviolet radiation. Within a few thousand years, large portions of the ozone layer had been stripped away. The sun itself became deadly. UV radiation intense enough to cause mutations, to burn through skin and leaf tissue, to damage DNA directly. Life that had evolved in the shade of a protective atmosphere suddenly found itself exposed to sterilizing radiation. And then came the carbon dioxide. Billions of tons of it released year after year, century after century. At first, the ocean absorbed a lot of it, but that just made the ocean acidification worse. Eventually, the oceans became saturated. They couldn't absorb anymore. The carbon dioxide began accumulating in the atmosphere, building up, creating a greenhouse effect that pushed global temperatures higher and higher. The best estimates suggest that global average temperatures rose by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much, but remember, this is the global average. Near the equator, temperatures probably exceeded 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. The interior of Pangaea became essentially uninhabitable, a dead zone where daytime temperatures were hot enough to kill anything that couldn't find deep caves or underground refuges. But even if you could survive the heat, you still had to breathe. This is where things got truly apocalyptic. As the oceans warmed, something terrible began happening in the deep water. For hundreds of millions of years, ocean currents had been cycling cold, oxygen-rich water from the poles down to the deep sea, keeping even the deepest parts of the ocean oxygenated. With temperatures skyrocketing, that circulation began to break down. The deep oceans became stagnant. Without oxygen, anaerobic bacteria took over. These bacteria don't breathe oxygen. They breathe sulfur compounds. Their waste product is hydrogen sulfide, poison gas, the same stuff that smells like rotten eggs, but in concentrations that are lethal to almost everything else. The deep oceans began filling with hydrogen sulfide, and then it started bubbling up to the surface. Within a few thousand years, massive blooms of sulfur bacteria had turned large portions of the ocean purple. Not a healthy colour. This was the colour of death. The hydrogen sulfide didn't stay in the water. It began escaping into the atmosphere. Coastal areas were poisoned. Animals that came to drink from rivers or the ocean were killed. The gas rose into the atmosphere, where it further damaged the ozone layer, creating a feedback loop of destruction. Marine life died in staggering numbers. The trilobites, those resilient creatures that had survived every previous extinction event, finally went extinct. Every single species gone. The great reefs collapsed completely, leaving nothing but rubble on the seafloor. Fish died en masse. The fossil record shows evidence of mass mortality events where millions of fish suffocated simultaneously as the water turned anoxic. On land, it wasn't much better. The forests died first. Between the heat, the acid rain, and the UV radiation, trees simply couldn't cope. Whole forests turned to dead wood, standing tinder, waiting for lightning strikes. When fires started, they burned for years, creating massive firestorms that consumed entire regions. The ash from these fires is preserved in rock layers all over the world, a testament to the scale of the destruction. With the forests gone, the herbivores had nothing to eat. They died. With the herbivores gone, the predators had nothing to hunt. They died too. Within a few thousand years, maybe as little as 60,000 years, the land was essentially empty. There were survivors, but they were tiny. Little lizard-like creatures hiding in burrows, small omnivores that could eat anything. Insects, though even they suffered massive losses. And fungi. The fungi loved it. For millions of years after the main extinction event, the fossil record shows an unusual spike in fungal remains. Dead wood everywhere, dead animals everywhere, and fungi specialized in breaking down dead organic matter. For a brief geological moment, Earth became a planet of mushrooms, growing on the corpses of the world that had been. The recovery took 10 million years. Let that sink in. Not thousands of years, not hundreds of thousands. 10 million years before biodiversity began to return to pre-extinction levels. 10 million years before complex ecosystems re-established themselves. That's longer than the entire history of hominids on Earth. Longer than the gap between us and the common ancestor we share with chimpanzees. But when life did recover, it came back different. The old dominant groups, the mammal-like reptiles that had ruled the Permian, never fully recovered. They hung on for a while, but they'd lost their edge. New groups began to rise. Archosaurs, the ancestors of dinosaurs and crocodiles. These were the groups that would come to dominate the Triassic period. Eventually, some of these archosaurs would evolve into the dinosaurs, and they would rule the world for 165 million years. The Permian-Triassic extinction didn't just reset life on Earth. It completely reordered it. It determined which groups would dominate for the next 200 million years. Without the Great Dying, there probably would have been no dinosaurs, no Tyrannosaurus rex, no Brontosaurus, no Velociraptor. Earth would have remained a planet of mammal-like reptiles. Human activities are releasing greenhouse gases at a rate comparable to the Siberian traps, but compressed into centuries instead of millennia. We're running the same experiment, just faster. The Great Dying shows us what happens when you push a planetary climate system past certain tipping points. Ocean acidification, oxygen depletion, runaway greenhouse effects. We're seeing early signs of all these today. We haven't reached Permian-Triassic levels, not even close, but we're headed in that direction. Once you cross certain thresholds, the system can spiral out of control in ways that are nearly impossible to stop. 252 million years ago, Earth nearly died. Life survived, but just barely. It took millions of years to recover, and when it did, the world that emerged was completely different from the world that had been. The Great Dying reminds us that planets can break, that there are limits to what living systems can tolerate, that once you push hard enough, Earth doesn't just reset, it nearly shuts down completely. Now picture a world 201 million years ago. Not the dinosaur paradise most imagine, but something far stranger. Dinosaurs existed, yes, but they weren't dominant. They were marginal players in a crowded ecosystem ruled by creatures you've probably never heard of. The real kings were the crurotarsans, massive crocodile-like animals. Some walked on 4 legs like modern crocodiles, but the successful ones stood upright on 2 legs. They had body plans similar to dinosaurs, hunting strategies that mirrored theirs, ecological roles that overlapped completely. In every practical sense, they were doing everything dinosaurs could do, except better. There were herbivorous crurotarsans that resembled the horned dinosaurs that would come later, predatory ones that hunted in coordinated packs. Some reached 20 feet in length and could take down prey several times their size. They had efficient metabolisms, sophisticated social behaviors, and they'd been perfecting their survival strategies for tens of millions of years. The dinosaurs were underdogs. Evolutionary also ran stuck in marginal niches, while their crocodilian cousins dominated the planet. And it wasn't just crurotarsans. The Triassic had enormous amphibians lurking in rivers and lakes, some growing to 15 feet long. Early mammal relatives called cynodonts prowled the underbrush, many surprisingly large and successful. Flying reptiles called pterosaurs had already taken to the skies. The oceans teemed with massive marine reptiles, ichthyosaurs and nothosaurs, that made modern great white sharks look timid. In this crowded world, dinosaurs occupied a handful of minor roles. They were mostly small to medium-sized animals. Some ate plants, some hunted smaller prey, but none were dominant. If you could have surveyed the Triassic landscape and tried to predict which group would inherit the Earth, you would never have picked dinosaurs. They simply weren't special enough, successful enough, dominant enough. But evolution doesn't care about who deserves to win. Around 201 million years ago, Pangaea, the supercontinent that had dominated Earth's geography for 100 million years, began to break apart. This wasn't gentle or gradual. This was violent, catastrophic, a tectonic divorce that would reshape the planet. As the Atlantic Ocean began forming, splitting what would become Africa and South America from North America and Europe, something unprecedented happened underground. Magma began rising through fractures in Earth's crust. Not from a single volcano, not even from a chain of volcanoes, but from thousands of fissures along a rupture zone that stretched for thousands of miles. This was the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. Over perhaps 500,000 years, though the worst probably happened much faster, these eruptions poured out enough lava to cover an area the size of Europe several feet deep. The lava itself wasn't the problem. The real killers were the gases. Those fissure eruptions released staggering amounts of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other volatile compounds directly into the atmosphere. The chemical signature preserved in rocks from this period tells a story of environmental chaos that makes modern climate change look like a minor inconvenience. The first wave of killing came from sulfur dioxide. When it reached the upper atmosphere, it created aerosols that reflected sunlight back into space. Global temperatures plummeted. Some estimates suggest cooling of 5 to 10 degrees Celsius in just a few years. For animals adapted to the warm, relatively stable Triassic climate, this was catastrophic. But here's where it gets diabolical. The sulfur aerosols only stayed in the atmosphere for a few years, maybe a decade. Then they rained out as sulfuric acid, devastating terrestrial and marine ecosystems. And once they were gone, all that carbon dioxide was still there, waiting. Global temperatures rebounded, but they didn't just return to normal. They shot past it. The carbon dioxide created a greenhouse effect that raised temperatures 3 to 6 degrees above pre-eruption levels. Within maybe 20 or 30 years, the world went from normal to freezing to lethally hot. The eruptions were episodic, coming in pulses separated by decades or centuries. Each new pulse meant another round of cooling followed by warming. Climate whiplash on a scale that makes ice ages look gentle. Ocean chemistry went haywire. The carbon dioxide dissolved in seawater, creating carbonic acid and driving ocean acidification. Coral reefs, which had been slowly recovering since the Permian extinction, collapsed again. Marine ecosystems that depended on calcium carbonate, anything with shells or external skeletons, struggled to survive. The oxygen content of the oceans fluctuated wildly. Some regions became anoxic dead zones. Others experienced toxic algae blooms that poisoned the food chain from the bottom up. On land, plants faced an impossible challenge. The rapid temperature swings meant that survival strategies that worked one decade were lethal the next. Cold-adapted plants expanded during cooling phases, only to be wiped out when temperatures spiked. Heat-tolerant species colonized new territories, then died en masse during the next cooling event. The fossil record from this period shows massive die-offs of plant species, followed by brief recoveries, followed by more die-offs. Forests that had stood for millions of years disappeared within generations, and the animals that depended on those plants were caught in a death spiral. Herbivores starved when vegetation collapsed. Predators starved when herbivores disappeared. Ecosystems that had been stable for tens of millions of years unraveled in what was, geologically speaking, the blink of an eye. Some researchers think the worst of the extinction happened in less than 10,000 years. Others think it might have been even faster, possibly just a few thousand years for the main killing event. When the volcanic gases finally cleared and the climate stabilized, about 80% of all species were gone. But the extinction was incredibly selective. It didn't kill everything equally. It picked winners and losers in ways that seem almost random until you look closely at the survival patterns. The Crurotarsans, those successful crocodile-like archosaurs that had dominated the Triassic, were nearly wiped out. A few small species survived, and their descendants eventually became modern crocodiles and alligators, relegated to rivers and swamps. But the giant terrestrial species, the ones that had outcompeted dinosaurs for tens of millions of years, all gone. The large amphibians, extinct. Most of the mammal-like cynodonts, dead. Many marine reptile groups vanished. But dinosaurs made it through. Not all of them, certainly. Many dinosaur species went extinct during the crisis. But enough survived to repopulate the planet. Why? What did dinosaurs have that crurotarsans didn't? Why did the underdog survive while the dominant groups perished? The answer seems related to metabolic efficiency and dietary flexibility. Recent research suggests that many early dinosaurs had more efficient respiratory systems than their competitors. They had evolved air sacs similar to modern birds that allowed them to extract more oxygen from each breath. In a world where oxygen levels were fluctuating and temperatures were swinging wildly, this efficiency advantage might have been the difference between survival and extinction. Dinosaurs also seem to have been more generalist feeders than many of their competitors. The crurotarsans had specialized, optimized for specific prey and specific hunting strategies. When ecosystems collapsed, their food sources disappeared and they couldn't adapt quickly enough. Many dinosaurs, particularly the early ones that survived the extinction, were more opportunistic. They could switch between different food sources, adjust their hunting strategies, survive on less. Size played a role too. Many of the dinosaurs that made it through were relatively small, with lower food requirements than the massive crurotarsans. In a world where food was scarce and unpredictable, being smaller and more efficient was an advantage. But perhaps most importantly, dinosaurs got lucky. And in mass extinctions, luck matters as much as adaptation. The specific regions where dinosaurs had their strongest populations happened to be areas where refugia, small pockets of relatively stable climate, persisted during the worst of the crisis. Some crurotarsan populations weren't so fortunate. They lived in regions where temperature swings were most extreme, where vegetation collapse was most complete. This is one of the hard truths about mass extinctions. They're not entirely fair. They don't always favor the best adapted or the most successful. Sometimes they favor the lucky, the groups that happen to be in the right place at the right time, with just enough of the right adaptations to squeak through. When the climate finally stabilized around 200 million years ago, the world that emerged was radically different from the one that had existed before. The ecological vacuum left by extinct crurotarsans and other groups was enormous, and dinosaurs, those former underdogs, were perfectly positioned to fill it. They diversified explosively. Within a few million years, dinosaurs had evolved into the massive long-necked sauropods, the armored stegosaurs, the predatory theropods, that would eventually produce species like Allosaurus and Tyrannosaurus rex. They spread across every continent, adapted to every terrestrial environment, and grew to sizes that still boggle the mind today. For the next 135 million years, dinosaurs would be the dominant large animals on land. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction had handed them the planet, not because they were superior, but because they survived when others didn't, because they were efficient enough, flexible enough, and lucky enough to make it through the crisis. But there's a deeper lesson here. Dominance is temporary. Success is no guarantee of survival. The crurotarsans had ruled for tens of millions of years, perfectly adapted to their world. Then the world changed, and adaptation didn't matter. The extinction didn't care about their evolutionary achievements or their ecological success. It only cared about who could survive rapid environmental change. The dinosaurs inherited an empty planet and made it their own. But their reign wouldn't last forever. Number 6 of 9. 135 million years later, they would face their own reset. And when it came, they would learn what the crurotarsans had learned, that no matter how successful you become, no matter how well adapted you are, Earth always keeps one more catastrophe in reserve. Picture a spring morning 66 million years ago. The sun rises over what will one day be the Yucatan Peninsula, but today it's a shallow tropical sea. The water is warm, crystal clear, teeming with ammonites and ancient fish. On the shores, flowering plants, a relatively new invention of evolution, bloom in colours the world has rarely seen before. Insects hum between the flowers. Birds, descendants of earlier dinosaurs, sing from the trees. Inland, across the vast forests and plains of late Cretaceous Earth, the dinosaurs rule. And not just rule, they thrive. This isn't the twilight of the dinosaur age. This is their golden hour. Tyrannosaurus rex stalks through the forests of what will become North America, the apex predator of a sophisticated ecosystem. Triceratops herds migrate across seasonal grasslands following the rains. In South America, the massive titanosaurs, the largest animals ever to walk on land, strip leaves from trees 40 feet above the ground. The dinosaurs have been the dominant land animals for 165 million years. For context, humans have only existed for about 300,000 years. The dinosaurs had already been running the planet for over 500 times longer than we've existed. They're not declining. They're not struggling. They're at the height of their evolutionary success, diversifying into new forms, adapting to new environments, spreading into every available ecological niche. Then in a single morning, everything ends. At 10:47 in the morning, give or take a few minutes, because who's really keeping time? A rock from space hits the shallow sea off the Yucatan. It's been traveling through the solar system for billions of years. An asteroid 10 kilometers wide, roughly the height of Mount Everest. It's been falling toward Earth for months, maybe years, growing brighter in the sky night by night. Some dinosaurs might have noticed it, that increasingly bright star that never moved with the others, but they had no concept of what it meant. The asteroid hits the ocean at 20 kilometers per second. That's 45,000 miles per hour. At that speed, air can't get out of the way fast enough. It compresses in front of the asteroid until it becomes plasma, hotter than the surface of the sun. The rock itself doesn't slow down. It doesn't splash into the water. It punches through the ocean like the ocean isn't even there, vaporizing millions of gallons of seawater instantly, and slams into the limestone bedrock below. The impact releases the energy of approximately 10 billion Hiroshima bombs all at once in a single point. Within microseconds, a crater 20 kilometers deep and 100 kilometers wide explodes into existence. Rock that has been solid for hundreds of millions of years simply ceases to exist, converted to plasma and vapor. The bedrock underneath, compressed beyond anything possible under normal conditions, rebounds like a springboard, creating a peak in the center of the crater that rises 10 kilometers high before collapsing. The energy from the impact has to go somewhere. It radiates outward in every direction at once. Within seconds, everything within 1,000 kilometers is simply obliterated. Not burned, not destroyed. Obliterated. Ceased to exist. Any dinosaur, any tree, any living thing within that radius is reduced to its component atoms before its nervous system could even register that something happened. But that's just the beginning. The impact throws debris into the atmosphere, not just rocks. Trillions of tons of vaporized rock, superheated to thousands of degrees. This material shoots upward faster than escape velocity. Within minutes, some of it is in space, but most of it arcs through the upper atmosphere and begins falling back to Earth, falling everywhere across North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia. Glowing fragments of impact debris rain down like a second sun. The thermal radiation from this debris is intense enough to ignite organic material across entire continents. Forests that have stood for millions of years burst into flame. Not just near the impact, everywhere. From Mexico to Montana, from California to the Carolinas, from the Amazon to the Arctic. Everything combustible begins to burn. The world becomes a furnace. Dinosaurs that survived the initial impact, that were far enough away to escape the immediate blast, now face a global firestorm. Hadrosaurs, those peaceful plant eaters, run in panic as the trees around them ignite. Tyrannosaurs, the apex predators who have never known fear, flee alongside their prey. Both species united in terror, but there's nowhere to run. The fires are everywhere. The smoke fills the sky. The heat becomes unbearable. Within hours, the atmospheric temperature has risen by dozens of degrees globally. Many dinosaurs simply cook alive, even if they never see a flame. Meanwhile, the impact has triggered something else. The energy transferred to Earth's crust sets off earthquakes worldwide. Magnitude 10, magnitude 11, scales of seismic activity that wouldn't be seen again for 66 million years. In the Gulf of Mexico, the ocean floor itself ripples like water. Tsunami waves 300 meters high radiate outward from the impact site. They cross the Gulf of Mexico in less than an hour, slamming into what will one day be Texas and Louisiana with the force of mountains made of water. They race across the Atlantic, reaching Africa within hours. No coastal ecosystem anywhere on Earth survives. The dinosaurs on the coasts, the ones who lived in the shallow seas and tidal zones, don't even get the dignity of a quick death. They're swept inland, tumbled through debris-filled water, drowned and crushed simultaneously. Their bodies are deposited miles from the sea, mixed with marine sediments and impact debris in a layer of rock that geologists will one day call the KPG boundary. Within 24 hours of impact, most large land animals are dead or dying. But the extinction event is just getting started. The debris in the atmosphere begins to settle, but there's so much of it. Trillions of tons of fine particulate matter, sulfur aerosols from vaporized limestone, soot from the global fires. All of it hangs in the air, blocking sunlight. Within weeks, the sky becomes dark. Not night dark, perpetual twilight dark. The sun becomes a dim orange disk, barely visible through the haze. Photosynthesis stops. Not completely, not everywhere, but enough. Plants that depend on full sunlight begin to die. Within months, forests that survive the initial fires begin to collapse as trees exhaust their energy reserves and find no light to replenish them. The plant die-off cascades through the food chain. Herbivorous dinosaurs, already stressed by the heat and fires, now face starvation. They strip what vegetation remains, but it's not enough. The great herds thin. The magnificent titanosaurs who need hundreds of pounds of plant matter daily begin to fall. Their bodies lie where they collapse. Too many for scavengers to consume. The carnivores do better at first. There's plenty of dead meat. Tyrannosaurs feed on carrion, something they probably did occasionally anyway, but now do exclusively. But the carrion doesn't last. Bodies rot, get consumed, or freeze in the cooling climate. Within a year, the carnivores face their own starvation. These apex predators, these kings of the Cretaceous, die slowly, their powerful bodies betraying them as their metabolism demands more food than the dying world can provide. The temperature is dropping now. With sunlight blocked, Earth's surface begins to cool. What had been a global furnace becomes a global freezer. The impact winter has begun. This isn't like natural winter. This is years of constant darkness and cold. Temperatures in many regions drop by 25 degrees Celsius or more. Water freezes. What few plants managed to survive the fires and darkness now face months or years of freezing temperatures in regions that were tropical just months before. And there's another factor making everything worse. Halfway around the world from the impact site, in what will one day be India, the Deccan Traps volcanic system has been erupting on and off for thousands of years. These aren't normal volcanoes. These are flood basalts, eruptions that pour lava across thousands of square kilometers, releasing massive amounts of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. Under normal circumstances, life could adapt to this. Species have survived similar eruptions before. But these aren't normal circumstances. The asteroid impact has stressed every ecosystem on Earth to the breaking point. The volcanic gases push many of them over the edge. Some researchers think the impact itself might have triggered increased volcanic activity, sending seismic shockwaves through Earth's crust that intensified the Deccan eruptions. Others think it's just terrible timing. Two separate disasters hitting the same planet within a few thousand years of each other. Either way, the combination is devastating. The 1-2 punch of impact winter, followed by volcanic climate disruption, ensures that Earth's climate remains chaotic for thousands of years. By the time the dust finally settles, literally, 75% of all species on Earth are gone. Not just the dinosaurs. Ammonites, those beautiful spiral-shelled marine animals that had survived every previous extinction, finally go extinct. Most marine reptiles disappear. Pterosaurs, the flying reptiles, vanish completely. Many plant species, especially those dependent on specific pollinators or growing conditions, die out. Entire ecosystems collapse like houses of cards. But some things survive. And what survives tells us everything about what it takes to live through a global catastrophe. The survivors share certain characteristics. They're small. They can survive on very little food. Many of them can burrow underground or hide in water. They're generalists, capable of eating whatever they can find rather than specialists dependent on specific foods. They're cold tolerant, capable of surviving temperature extremes. Most importantly, they can reproduce quickly, allowing them to recover faster when conditions improve. Mammals fit this profile perfectly. During the Cretaceous, mammals had been small, mostly nocturnal creatures living in the shadows of the dinosaurs. The largest was about the size of a raccoon. Most were mouse or rat-sized. They could burrow. They had fur for insulation. They were already adapted to cold nights. They could eat almost anything. Insects, plants, seeds, whatever they found. When the impact winter hit, these small furry survivors retreated underground, living off seeds and roots and insects, waiting out the darkness in burrows where the temperature stayed relatively stable. Birds survived too, though most bird species went extinct. The survivors were again small ground-dwelling species that could eat seeds and hide in vegetation or burrows. The large flightless birds, the specialized species that had adapted to specific ecosystems, they died. But the small adaptable ones made it through. Crocodiles and turtles, those ancient reptile lineages, survived. They're cold-blooded, so they don't need as much food. They can brumate, entering a state of dormancy during cold or harsh conditions. They can eat carrion when necessary. Crocodiles can go months without eating. These traits, which might seem like disadvantages during normal times, became life-saving during the catastrophe. In the oceans, the survivors were similar. Small fish, generalist feeders, species that could live in deep water where the surface chaos mattered less. Sharks survived. Those ancient predators whose basic body plan had already been working for hundreds of millions of years. Some marine mammals, early ancestors of whales, made it through. The coral reefs mostly died, but some corals survived in deeper water and would eventually recolonize the shallows. When the skies finally cleared, maybe 10 years after impact, maybe 100, the survivors emerged into a transformed world. The dominant life forms of the Cretaceous were gone. The age of dinosaurs was over. But for the survivors, this was an opportunity. With the dinosaurs gone, ecological niches stood empty. Forests began to recover, starting with fast-growing ferns and eventually rebuilding into complex ecosystems. And the mammals, those small furry survivors, began to diversify. Within a few million years, mammals would evolve into forms that would have been impossible while the dinosaurs lived. Some became large herbivores, filling the niches left by sauropods and hadrosaurs. Others became predators. Within 10 million years, some mammals were as large as bears. Within 25 million years, some were as large as elephants. The ancestors of whales returned to the sea. The ancestors of bats took to the air. And one small group of tree-dwelling mammals developed forward-facing eyes, grasping hands, and unusually large brains. They would eventually become primates. And much later, after many more millions of years of evolution, they would become us. We exist because a rock from space killed the dinosaurs. That's not speculation or theory. That's documented fact written in rock layers around the world. Without the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, mammals would still be small nocturnal creatures hiding from dinosaurs. There would be no primates, no humans, no civilization. The most catastrophic event in the last 100 million years created the conditions for our existence. But it also teaches us something terrifying. Earth's reset button can be pushed at any moment. And when it is, size and strength mean nothing. Dominance means nothing. What matters is adaptability, resilience, the ability to survive when everything goes wrong. The dinosaurs ruled for 165 million years and disappeared in decades. The question hanging over us now is simple. When Earth's next reset comes, will we be the dinosaurs or the mammals? Picture the planet right now, seen from far above. City lights glowing like constellations, cargo ships crawling across the oceans like slow-moving insects, highways glowing faintly in the dark, tracing out the veins of a very strange new ecosystem. Now zoom the camera down into a rainforest that used to be continuous green, uninterrupted horizon. Now sliced into fragments by roads, mines, plantations. Into coral reefs that once looked like underwater cities of colour and life, now bleached white like bone. Into grasslands turned to dust. Wetlands drained for fields. Rivers dammed into silent artificial lakes. Life is still everywhere. Birds still sing, trees still grow, fish still swim, but the numbers are different. If you could see species the way a geneticist does, as data points on a long timeline, you'd notice something deeply unsettling. The dots are disappearing fast. Scientists call it the extinction rate, the pace at which species vanish from the planet. Over the last 500 million years, during normal times between mass extinctions, that background rate has been relatively slow. Maybe one species out of every million disappearing each year, mostly replaced by the slow, patient work of evolution. But when researchers look at the last century or two, they see something else entirely. By every serious estimate, today's extinction rate is between 100 and 1,000 times higher than that long-term background. Some studies suggest it might even be more. Species that once numbered in the millions are now down to thousands. Others are already gone, known only from dusty museum drawers and fading photographs. And many are disappearing before we even notice they existed. Entire evolutionary lineages erased without even getting a name. To paleontologists, this pattern looks eerily familiar. A spike in extinctions, a rapid loss of biodiversity, ecosystems unraveling not over millions of years, but over centuries and decades. On geological timescales, that's instant. So the question hangs in the air like a quiet warning. Are we already living through Earth's sixth mass extinction? And if we are, what's driving it this time? In the past, the culprits were things like supervolcanoes, asteroid impacts, runaway climate shifts triggered by deep-time tectonics. Forces utterly beyond the control of any individual organism. This time the main driver is a single species. Us. It didn't happen all at once. For most of human history, we were just clever animals, nudging ecosystems here and there, burning patches of forest to encourage game, hunting some species harder than others, spreading plants and animals along our trade routes. But as our population grew and our tools got sharper, our influence crossed an invisible threshold. What began as local changes started to merge, link and stack until they became something else entirely. A planetary scale force. Think of all the ways we reshape the world, often without meaning to. We clear forests for timber, cattle, soy, palm oil. Huge areas that once held a riot of species become simplified landscapes of one or two crops. We drain wetlands, straighten rivers, build dams and levees. Habitats that evolved over millions of years vanish in a few construction seasons. We burn fossil fuels, releasing carbon that had been stored underground since before the dinosaurs. The atmosphere thickens with greenhouse gases. The climate shifts faster than in most past natural events, pushing species out of the narrow ranges of temperature and rainfall they're adapted to. We fill the air and water with pollution. Plastics that break into microscopic fragments, pesticides that drift on the wind, heavy metals washed into rivers, nitrogen from fertilizers creating dead zones in the sea. Each chemical, each compound, another small stress piled onto already stressed organisms. We hunt and fish with industrial efficiency. Vast nets rake the ocean floor. Factory ships process entire schools of fish in hours. Bushmeat hunting and wildlife trade empty forests of large mammals and birds. We move organisms around the world accidentally and on purpose. Rats, cats, pigs, diseases, invasive plants and insects leap continents in the holds of ships and airplanes, outcompeting or devouring native species that have no defenses. Any one of these forces might have been manageable on its own. Combined, they create something like the perfect storm. And some of the earliest, clearest signs that the storm is here come from a group of creatures most of us barely notice. Insects. For hundreds of millions of years, insects have been the quiet machinery of Earth's ecosystems, pollinating flowers, recycling dead matter, feeding birds, bats, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and countless other creatures. They are the gears and cogs that keep the living world turning. Now, in many places, those gears are grinding down. Long-term studies in Europe, North America, and elsewhere show insect populations dropping by 50%, 70%, sometimes more over just a few decades. In some regions, the total biomass of flying insects has crashed by 3/4 or more. The insect apocalypse, some scientists call it. It doesn't look dramatic at first glance. No mushroom clouds, no tidal waves, just fewer bugs on the windshield than you remember from childhood. Quieter summer nights, fewer butterflies in the fields, fewer fireflies in the dark. But the consequences ripple outward. Fewer insects mean less food for birds. Songbirds that relied on insect-rich springs to feed their chicks now struggle. Their numbers fall. Bats lose their primary prey. Frogs and lizards go hungry. Pollinators vanish. And with them, the plants that depended on them. It's like carefully removing screws from a plane in mid-flight. You might not notice a problem at first, but piece by piece the structure weakens until one day something essential gives way. Meanwhile, beneath the surface of the oceans, another crisis is unfolding. One that echoes in unsettling ways the worst mass extinction in Earth's history, the Great Dying of the Permian Triassic. When we burn coal, oil, and gas, the carbon dioxide doesn't just stay in the sky. A large fraction dissolves into the oceans. There, it reacts with seawater to form carbonic acid, lowering the pH of the water. Slowly, steadily, the seas grow more acidic. To us, the change is almost imperceptible. A small shift on a pH scale you might have last seen in a high school textbook. To marine life that builds shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate, it's a different story. As the water becomes more acidic, those minerals become harder to form, easier to dissolve. Shells thin, coral skeletons weaken, larval shellfish struggle to survive their earliest, most vulnerable stages. Coral reefs, which support an extraordinary fraction of marine biodiversity, are hit with a double blow. Acidification from below and warming from above. When water gets too warm, corals expel the symbiotic algae that feed them, turning ghostly white. If the heat lasts too long, they die. In Earth's deep past, similar combinations of rapid carbon release, warming, and ocean acidification drove several major extinction events. During the Great Dying, massive volcanic eruptions poured greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Temperatures soared, the oceans turned acidic, and in many regions, oxygen poor. Up to 90% of marine species vanished. We are not there. Not yet. But when geochemists compare the current rate of carbon release to those ancient events, they see uncomfortable parallels. In some ways, today's changes are even faster. So are we already in a sixth mass extinction? Here, this story becomes more complicated. On one side, many biologists argue that we've already crossed the threshold. They point to the spike in extinction rates, the widespread collapse of populations, the fragmentation of habitats, the accumulating signs of planetary-scale disruption. From their perspective, the sixth extinction isn't something that might happen in the future. It's already underway, unfolding all around us. On the other side, some scientists are more cautious. They agree that the trends are alarming, that we're digging a deep hole, but they note that so far, the absolute number of documented extinctions is still lower than in the 5 great die-offs of the past. They argue that with rapid coordinated action, we might still pull back from the brink, flatten the extinction curve before it becomes a true mass extinction in the strict geological sense. Part of the uncertainty comes from simple ignorance. We don't even know how many species exist on Earth. Estimates range from a few million to tens of millions. Many are small, hidden, poorly studied. Insects, fungi, microbes in soil and deep ocean. They can disappear long before anyone notices. So it's possible that we're undercounting the losses, that the sixth extinction is further along than we think. It's also possible that some parts of the living world are more resilient than we fear, able to bounce back if we give them space and time. What's clear is that we are in a narrow window. We can still influence how severe this reset will be, how many branches of the tree of life are pruned, how long it will take for ecosystems to recover, if they ever truly do. And within this unfolding crisis, not all species face the same fate. The most vulnerable share particular traits that evolution once rewarded, but now condemn them. They're habitat specialists. They need old-growth forests, intact coral reefs, pristine wetlands, places that are vanishing faster than they can adapt. They occupy narrow geographic ranges, a single island, one mountain range, a particular river system. When that habitat goes, they go with it. They reproduce slowly. Few offspring, long gestation periods, years invested in each young one. Large mammals embody this perfectly. Elephants, rhinos, great apes, but also big birds, sea turtles, ancient trees that take decades to reach maturity. These are species evolution crafted carefully over millions of years, polishing them for specific niches. They're rare jewels in the ecological tapestry, beautiful, irreplaceable, and heartbreakingly fragile. When environments shift rapidly, specialists can't pivot. The panda that evolved to eat almost exclusively bamboo can't suddenly switch to grass. The orchid pollinated by one specific moth species can't attract different pollinators when that moth disappears. The alpine plant adapted to cool mountain peaks can't migrate when warming pushes its climate zone off the top of the mountain entirely. Then there are the generalists, the opportunists, species that treat human disturbance not as catastrophe, but as invitation. Rats thrive in our cities, eating our garbage, living in our walls, spreading across continents in our cargo ships. Crows and pigeons colonize urban environments, nesting on buildings, scavenging from dumpsters, learning to drop nuts on roads so cars crack them open. Cockroaches have been perfecting their survival skills for 300 million years. They can eat almost anything, live almost anywhere, survive radiation levels that would kill most other organisms. Certain weeds explode across disturbed ground. Dandelions, kudzu, species that reproduce quickly, spread aggressively, adapt to contaminated soils. Some fish do well in warming, polluted waters. Jellyfish bloom in overfished oceans where their competitors and predators have been removed. Bacteria and fungi evolve to digest our waste. There are microbes now that can break down plastics, hydrocarbons, even some heavy metals. They're turning our pollution into food, And humans, of course. We're the ultimate generalists. We live from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests. We eat everything from kelp to caribou. We've modified environments across every continent. If the sixth extinction unfolds fully, these are likely the winners. Not because they're superior in some moral sense, but because they're flexible. They can roll with chaos. They thrive in simplified ecosystems where complexity has collapsed. In a world losing its specialists, the future belongs to whoever can eat garbage and live in ruins. That future sounds bleak. Rats and cockroaches inheriting the earth. But evolution doesn't judge. It just fills empty niches. And those generalists, given millions of years, could diversify into forms we can't imagine. Rats could evolve into dozens of species. Some larger, filling roles left by foxes and small cats. Others adapting to trees or coastlines or underground labyrinths. We know this happens because rodents have done it before. After each previous extinction, the survivors radiated into new forms. Corvids might take a different path. They're already remarkably intelligent. Tool users, problem solvers. They recognize individual human faces, pass information between generations. In a world that's lost large mammals but retained forests and scattered ruins, there might be intense selection for bigger brains, better memory, more sophisticated social structures. Fast forward 10 million years, and you might have crow descendants that are even more clever, more social, experimenting with protoculture. Octopuses offer another possibility. They have complex nervous systems. They solve puzzles. They use tools. They can change color and texture instantaneously, essentially thinking with their skin. Right now they live fast and die young, most species surviving only a year or two. But in warmer altered oceans where cephalopods are already increasing in number, evolution might favor longer lives, more time to learn, opportunities for social complexity that current octopuses never experience. This is speculation, obviously. Evolution isn't predictable. It doesn't follow scripts or repeat patterns exactly. What we can say with certainty is simpler and stranger. Empty ecological roles don't stay empty. When herbivores vanish, something evolves to eat plants. When predators disappear, something else develops teeth or claws or venom to fill that niche. The details are unpredictable. The general pattern is ironclad. But here's the twist that makes this moment unique. Unlike trilobites facing the Ordovician freeze, or dinosaurs watching an asteroid brighten in their sky, one species currently driving planetary change can actually understand what's happening. We can measure extinction rates in real time, model climate futures, map shrinking ranges of endangered species, name what's occurring, imagine alternatives. We're simultaneously the asteroid and the only creature that could choose to deflect it. Right now, in a rainforest fragment somewhere, a beetle no scientist has ever catalogued is climbing a leaf in darkness. It has no name, no conservation status, no awareness that its entire species might vanish within years. On a coral reef, a tiny polyp is trying to build its first calcium carbonate skeleton in water that's slightly more acidic than any of its ancestors experienced. The chemistry is different enough to make construction harder, but not yet impossible. In soil beneath your feet, fungi are weaving mycorrhizal networks between plant roots, exchanging nutrients, sending chemical signals, doing the quiet work they've done since before humans existed. They don't know about mass extinctions. They just keep trying to grow, to connect, to survive. These organisms are all playing their parts in a drama stretching back nearly 4 billion years. Whether we're witnessing the opening act of a true sixth mass extinction or standing at a precipice we can still step back from depends more than ever on choices made by one recently evolved primate, us. In past extinctions, survivors were passive participants. They endured or they perished. No planning, no prevention. Just evolutionary luck and blind circumstance. This time is fundamentally different because we can see the pattern unfolding. We can read warning signs, rising temperatures, acidifying oceans, collapsing insect populations, species vanishing faster than they can be named. The trilobites had no idea what was killing them. The dinosaurs couldn't model asteroid impact scenarios. The Permian synapsids didn't understand atmospheric chemistry or feedback loops. They just died when the world changed too fast. We know what mass extinctions look like. We can trace the mechanisms. And critically, we can still influence the outcome. That doesn't guarantee we'll act wisely. History is full of civilizations that saw disaster coming and failed to respond adequately. But it means action is possible. The window hasn't closed. Not yet. Every choice about energy, about land use, about consumption, about population, about technology, about how we value other species, these choices are writing the next chapter of Earth's story. We can be just another thin layer in the rock record. A brief spike of carbon and plastic and strange isotopes. A cautionary tale for whatever intelligent species might evolve millions of years hence. Or we could be something unprecedented. The first species that recognized a mass extinction while it was still unfolding and decided to stop it. The first to say not this time, not if we can help it. The stakes are almost incomprehensibly high. Not just for us, though human civilization would certainly be devastated by ecosystem collapse. But for millions of other species, for evolutionary lineages that took hundreds of millions of years to develop, for possibilities we'll never know if they vanish now. Every time you learn more about deep time, about how Earth resets itself, you gain leverage over the future. You start seeing how fragile this window is, how valuable, how brief. The forests whose smell you recognize after rain, the specific birds whose songs mark your mornings, the coral reefs in their current exact arrangement of species and colors, the elephants, the whales, the frogs, the bees, the soil microbes supporting our crops, the predators keeping ecosystems balanced. They're all products of hundreds of millions of years of evolution and 5 previous resets. They won't come again the same way. We stand at a strange intersection in Earth's history. We're both product of past catastrophes and potential cause of the next one. We carry in our genes the legacy of ancient survivors. Every cell in your body contains molecular machinery refined through 5 mass extinctions. You're here because your ancestors were small enough, flexible enough, lucky enough to make it through moments when most life didn't. And now we hold power no previous species ever possessed. The power to decide how much of the present joins the list of things that exist only as fossils. The deep future will remember us somehow, either as a thin line of disturbance, a brief experiment in planetary scale intelligence that burned bright and burned out, or as something else, a turning point. The moment when one species recognized what it was doing and chose differently. That choice is still being written. You're living inside that moment between the 5th reset and whatever comes next. Breathing air made by ancient oceans, standing on ground shaped by extinct forests and vanished seas. Part of a lineage that survived everything the planet ever threw at it. And for a little while in this narrow window of time, you have a rare chance to decide how gently or how violently you leave your trace in the stone. The choice isn't abstract anymore. It's happening in real time, measured not in geological epochs, but in budget meetings, infrastructure decisions, dietary choices, voting patterns, every policy debate about energy grids, every conversation about meat consumption, every decision about whether to expand a highway or build a rail line. These are the mechanisms through which we're either writing a tragedy or scripting a comeback. Consider what distinguishes us from every other dominant species that came before. The dinosaurs couldn't see the asteroid coming. The trilobites had no concept of glaciation. The Permian synapsids never understood that volcanic gases were suffocating their world. They were passengers on a runaway train with no ability to reach the brakes. We're different. Not because we're smarter in some absolute sense. Intelligence has evolved many times. But we're the first species that can model the future trace cause and effect across decades and centuries, communicate solutions across continents instantly, and coordinate responses at planetary scale. We built the train, we're driving it, and we can see the cliff ahead. The question isn't whether we have the tools. We do. Renewable energy technologies exist. Agricultural methods that restore rather than deplete soil are proven. Marine protected areas work. Reforestation programs succeed when properly funded. The engineering is solved. The economics increasingly favor transition. What remains is political will, coordinated action, and the willingness to prioritize long-term survival over short-term convenience. Here's where it gets personal. You're not a passive observer in this story. The average person in an industrialized nation makes dozens of choices every week that ripple into these planetary systems. What you eat, how you travel, what you buy, how you vote, where you invest, what you amplify or ignore on social media. None of these choices alone tips the balance, but multiplied by billions of people making similar decisions, they become the difference between trajectories. This isn't about guilt. Guilt is paralyzing, and paralysis is exactly what we can't afford. It's about recognizing leverage. You're living at a moment when individual choices aggregate into geological consequences. That's unprecedented. Terrifying, yes, but also strangely empowering. Think back to those survivors we talked about. The small mammals that inherited the post-Cretaceous world weren't heroic. They were opportunistic, adaptable, able to thrive in marginal environments. They didn't plan to become the ancestors of whales and primates and bats. They just survived long enough for evolution to explore new possibilities. But we can do something they couldn't. We can plan. We can intentionally create conditions for survival, not just our own, but for the millions of other species we share this planet with. We can choose to be a bottleneck that preserves biodiversity rather than eliminates it. We can decide that this reset, if it comes, will be gentler than the others. There's a concept in ecology called a keystone species. Remove it, and entire ecosystems collapse. Add it back, and landscapes transform. Wolves reintroduced to Yellowstone changed river courses because they changed elk behavior, which changed vegetation patterns, which changed erosion patterns. One species, cascading effects. Humans are the ultimate keystone species now. We're present in every ecosystem, influencing every major Earth system. That means our choices about how we exist on this planet determine what kind of world emerges over the next few centuries, not through some vague metaphorical influence, through measurable physical processes, carbon budgets, extinction rates, ocean chemistry. The geological record will show our presence no matter what. That thin layer of plastics and isotopes and extinct species fossils, it's already being deposited. The question is, what comes after? Does the layer mark a brief catastrophic pulse followed by slow recovery? Or does it show a species that recognized the pattern, understood the stakes, and chose differently? Every previous mass extinction offers lessons. The Ordovician teaches that climate stability matters more than we intuited. The Devonian shows that even beneficial innovations like forests can have devastating unintended consequences at scale. The Permian demonstrates that once you trigger certain feedback loops, they become nearly impossible to stop. The Triassic-Jurassic reveals that rapid environmental oscillations are often deadlier than steady change. The Cretaceous proves that no amount of dominance guarantees survival when conditions shift suddenly. Put them together and the message is clear. Planetary systems have thresholds. Push past them and the rules change. What was stable becomes chaotic. What was predictable becomes random. And once you've crossed certain lines, you can't simply reverse course by stopping the behavior that caused the problem. The momentum carries forward. We're approaching several of these thresholds simultaneously. Ice sheet collapse, permafrost methane release, Amazon rainforest dieback, coral reef extinction. Each represents a point of no return, a transition from a world where restoration is possible to one where we're simply managing decline. Some of these thresholds we've probably already crossed. The question is how many more we hit before we change trajectory, because each one makes the next more likely. This is the compound interest of catastrophe. Small bad decisions accumulating into massive structural problems that become exponentially harder to solve. But compound interest works both ways. Small good decisions also accumulate. Every fraction of a degree we don't warm is countless lives saved, ecosystems preserved, possibilities kept open. Every species we prevent from going extinct is an entire evolutionary lineage maintained. Every forest protected, every wetland restored, every fishing ground allowed to recover. These aren't symbolic victories. They're physical interventions that change planetary outcomes. The deep time perspective reveals something profound. From the planet's viewpoint, we're not special. We're just another experiment, another evolutionary innovation that either works out or doesn't. Earth will continue regardless. But from our viewpoint, from the perspective of every other species currently alive, from the standpoint of whatever future ecosystems might emerge, this moment matters enormously. Because we're deciding not just our own fate, but the fate of millions of other species who have no voice in these decisions. The elephants and tigers and pangolins, the songbirds and sea turtles and salmon, the countless invertebrates and plants and fungi that form the living matrix we depend on, they're all passengers on this train we're driving. Their survival depends on choices we make in boardrooms and voting booths and grocery stores. That's the weight we carry. Not guilt, but responsibility. The opportunity to be better ancestors than we've been custodians. To leave a world that's richer, more diverse, more resilient than the one we inherited, rather than impoverished and simplified. History is full of societies that failed this test, that saw environmental collapse coming and couldn't or wouldn't change course. Easter Island, the Maya, the Norse Greenland settlements. Their cautionary tales written in abandoned cities and eroded landscapes. But history also contains societies that made hard choices, that sacrificed immediate gain for long-term survival, that reorganized their entire way of life when circumstances demanded it. We have advantages they didn't. Global communication, unprecedented wealth, technological capabilities they couldn't have imagined, scientific understanding of cause and effect. What we lack is the cultural and political will to deploy these advantages fast enough. And that brings us back to you, lying there in the dark, thinking about trilobites and dinosaurs and mass extinctions. You're not powerless. You're part of the aggregate that determines outcomes. Your choices matter because they combine with billions of other choices to create the conditions that either push us over thresholds or pull us back from edges. This isn't a call to solve everything yourself. It's recognition that you're part of the solution or part of the problem, and the distinction isn't always obvious. It requires constant evaluation, willingness to change, acceptance that convenience isn't always compatible with survival. The deep time perspective should be humbling but not defeating. Yes, we're tiny and brief. Yes, the planet will outlast us. Yes, mass extinctions have happened before and could happen again. But we're also remarkable. We're the universe's way of understanding itself, matter organized in such a way that it can contemplate its own history and future. That's worth preserving. Somewhere right now, a researcher is modeling climate futures. An engineer is designing more efficient solar panels. A farmer is testing regenerative agriculture. A politician is drafting environmental legislation. A teacher is explaining ecology to students. A parent is making choices about how to raise children in an uncertain world. All of them are writing the next chapter alongside you. The story of Earth's 6 mass extinctions doesn't have to end with complete catastrophe. It could end with the first time a species recognized what it was doing, understood the consequences, and changed course. That would be unprecedented, historic in the truest sense. You carry in your cells the molecular memory of every survival, every adaptation, every innovation that led to this moment. 4 billion years of unbroken lineage. Every ancestor you have, going back to the first replicating molecules, successfully survived long enough to reproduce. That's your inheritance. An unbroken chain of survival through 5 previous resets. Now you're living through what might become the 6th. And unlike every ancestor before you, you know it. You can name it. You can measure it. You can imagine alternatives. That knowledge is power. The power to choose. The power to act. The power to be part of the generation that didn't look away. The 5 extinctions we've explored aren't just ancient history. They're case studies, field guides for recognizing when planetary systems are breaking down. And when you lay them side by side with what's happening right now, the parallels become difficult to ignore. Rapid climate warming. Check. Ocean acidification. Check. Habitat destruction at continental scale. Check. Oxygen depletion in marine environments. Beginning to appear. Mass die-offs of key species groups. Accelerating. Each extinction had its own signature, its own particular combination of stressors. What makes our current moment so unsettling is that we're triggering multiple signatures simultaneously. But here's what the deep time view also reveals. Catastrophes, even planetary scale ones, aren't instantaneous. They unfold, they build, they cascade through systems over timescales that seem slow by human standards, but are breathtakingly fast geologically. The Great Dying took tens of thousands of years to fully manifest. The late Devonian oxygen crisis played out in pulses over 20 million years, which means there are inflection points, moments when trajectories can still shift, windows when intervention matters. We're in one of those windows now. Not at the beginning anymore. We've already committed to some amount of disruption, but not at the end either. The worst outcomes aren't inevitable yet. Think about those survivors again, the ones who made it through when most didn't. They weren't selected for strength or intelligence or dominance. They were selected for flexibility, efficiency, ability to thrive in margins, capacity to shift strategies when conditions changed. Those same traits define successful responses to crisis at any scale. Societies that survive disruptions are the ones that can adapt quickly, that don't cling to strategies that no longer work, that can reorganize around new realities without collapsing entirely. We have examples throughout human history, cultures that faced environmental collapse and managed controlled transformation rather than chaotic disintegration. The Dutch responding to flood risk by completely reimagining their relationship with water. Japan's Edo period, achieving sustainable forestry after near-total deforestation. Costa Rica reversing deforestation trends and becoming a biodiversity haven. These aren't perfect analogies, the scale is different, but they demonstrate that humans can make collective choices that prioritize long-term survival over short-term extraction. The challenge we face is making those choices fast enough and at large enough scale to matter. Because unlike the Ordovician trilobites or Cretaceous dinosaurs, we don't have millions of years to adapt. We have decades, maybe a century if we're lucky. That's the time frame in which we either stabilize critical Earth systems or watch them cascade into new configurations that won't support the civilization we've built. But decades is also enough time. Enough time to transition energy systems. Enough time to protect and restore key ecosystems. Enough time to shift agricultural practices. Enough time to stabilize population growth. Enough time to develop technologies we haven't imagined yet. The physics allows it. The economics increasingly support it. What's required is sustained coordinated effort at every level, from individual choices to international agreements. And this is where your particular moment in history becomes so strange and significant. You're alive during the narrow window when these choices are being made. The decisions playing out right now in governments, corporations, communities, and households are determining what kind of planet exists 200 years from now, 500 years, 5,000 years. Most humans who've ever lived didn't have that kind of leverage. They were born into conditions they couldn't meaningfully alter. They survived or didn't based on circumstances beyond their control. But you're living in an era where aggregate human choice is the dominant force shaping planetary conditions. That's unprecedented weight to carry. It's also unprecedented opportunity. The deep time lens makes human concerns feel simultaneously trivial and cosmically important. Trivial because we're so brief, so small against the vast sweep of geological time. A species that's existed for maybe 300,000 years on a planet 4.5 billion years old. We're a rounding error, a statistical blip, but also important because we're the first blip that can see itself in context, the first evolutionary experiment that can study previous experiments and learn from them, the first species that can intentionally choose what kind of ancestor it wants to be. Every extinction created opportunities for whatever survived. The Ordovician freeze made space for fish to diversify. The Devonian oxygen crisis pushed life onto land. The Great Dying cleared the way for dinosaurs. The Triassic-Jurassic event gave dinosaurs the planet. The Cretaceous impact opened niches for mammals. Each catastrophe was simultaneously an ending and a beginning. If we're entering the sixth extinction, the same pattern will hold. Something will survive. Something will radiate into empty niches. Something will inherit whatever world emerges. The question is whether we're part of that something or whether we're just another layer in the rock, a thin band of unusual chemistry marking the moment when a clever ape briefly destabilized its own life support system. The answer depends on what happens in the next few decades, on whether we treat this as a problem to be solved or an inconvenience to be ignored, on whether we're willing to reorganize societies around survival rather than short-term profit, on whether enough people in enough places make enough different choices to shift the aggregate. You can't solve this alone. No individual can. But you're not alone. You're part of 8 billion decision makers whose collective choices add up to planetary outcomes. Every time you choose differently, you shift the aggregate slightly. Multiply that by millions of people making similar shifts, and you get phase transitions, tipping points that work in our favor for once. The survivors of previous extinctions didn't know they were survivors. They were just living, just trying to get through each day, finding food, avoiding predators, reproducing when possible. They survived because they happened to have traits that worked in the new reality. They were lucky. We have a different option. We can be intentional survivors. We can look at what's coming, understand the mechanisms, and actively work to create conditions where more survives. We can choose to preserve rather than destroy, to restore rather than extract, to cooperate rather than compete ourselves into oblivion. That's never been possible before. No previous extinction event included a species capable of understanding what was happening and modifying its behavior accordingly. This is genuinely new, an evolutionary innovation as significant as flight or photosynthesis. Consciousness that can model futures and choose between them. Whether that innovation succeeds or fails is being determined now, not in some distant future. Right now, in this strange moment you're living through, where you can learn about ancient catastrophes on a device connected to a global network, while sitting in a structure designed to protect you from elements, in a world being rapidly transformed by your species' collective activity. The trilobites couldn't stop the glaciation. The dinosaurs couldn't deflect the asteroid. The Permian synapsids couldn't shut down the Siberian traps. But we can reduce emissions. We can protect habitats. We can change agricultural practices. We can restore degraded ecosystems. We can choose how hard we push against planetary boundaries. That's the strange privilege and burden of being alive right now. You're living through a pivot point in Earth's history. A moment when one species' choices ripple across millions of other species' fates. When decisions made in the next few decades echo forward for geological timescales. The rocks will remember this moment regardless of what we do. The chemical signatures are already being laid down. The question is, what story those signatures tell? A brief catastrophic pulse followed by slow recovery, or something unprecedented? A species that saw the pattern forming and chose differently. You're not just watching this story unfold, you're writing it. Every choice about how you live, what you support, what you oppose, what you create, what you preserve, all of it matters because all of it aggregates with billions of other choices into the conditions that either push us over thresholds or pull us back from edges. The deep time perspective should make you feel both small and significant. Small because you're so brief against the vast sweep of time. Significant because your brief moment happens to coincide with a pivot point. You're here during the narrow window when human choice determines what kind of world exists for the next million years. That's not hyperbole. That's just physics and chemistry and biology playing out at planetary scale. The carbon we emit stays in the atmosphere for thousands of years. The species we drive extinct can't re-evolve. The feedbacks we trigger continue cascading long after we're gone. We're setting initial conditions for processes that will unfold across timescales we can barely comprehend. But we're also capable of remarkable things when we choose to be. We've eradicated diseases, restored ecosystems, pulled species back from the brink of extinction, cleaned up polluted rivers and lakes, reversed ozone depletion. We can cooperate at massive scale when we recognize existential threats. The question is whether we'll recognize this threat clearly enough and quickly enough to respond effectively. Whether we'll treat it with the urgency it demands rather than the complacency it's so far received. Whether we'll make the hard choices that prioritize long-term survival over short-term convenience. You can't answer that question for everyone, but you can answer it for yourself. You can decide what kind of ancestor you want to be, what kind of legacy you want to leave in the rock record. Whether your life added to the problem or contributed to solutions. That's the choice in front of you. Not abstract, not distant, immediate and concrete. Every day presents opportunities to choose differently, to align your life more closely with the world you want to exist, to be part of the aggregate that shifts trajectories. The 5 previous extinctions teach us that catastrophes happen, that planetary systems can break down catastrophically. That dominance is no shield against extinction when conditions shift rapidly. But they also teach us that life persists, that survivors radiate into empty niches, that evolution explores new possibilities after each reset. We're in a position to influence which lessons apply to us, whether we're the dominant species that couldn't adapt quickly enough, or the flexible survivors who recognized danger and changed course. Whether we trigger a full reset or navigate through disruption while preserving most of what matters, the rocks will tell that story eventually. Future geologists, if there are any, will study the layers we're depositing now. They'll see the spike in carbon, the spread of microplastics, the sudden disappearance of so many species. They'll debate what caused it and how quickly it happened and what survived. But they won't know about the choices individual humans faced, the daily decisions about how to live in a world being transformed, the struggle between convenience and conscience, the difficulty of coordinating responses across divided societies, the weight of being the generation that had to choose. That's your story to tell through how you live, through the choices you make about what matters and what doesn't, through how you respond to the knowledge that you're living, through a potential mass extinction that you have some power to influence. The trilobites had no such power. The dinosaurs had no such knowledge. You have both. What you do with them determines not just your own fate, but the fate of countless species who have no voice in these decisions. That's the responsibility you carry. Not guilt, not blame. Just the simple recognition that your choices ripple forward into deep time. You're part of the first generation that can look at Earth's history of extinctions and say, not this time. Not if we can help it. The first that can study how planetary systems break down and actively work to stabilize them. The first that can choose to be ancestors worth remembering rather than warnings worth heeding. That choice is yours. Make it carefully. Make it consciously. Make it in ways that align with the world you want to exist centuries from now, when whatever comes next looks back at this moment and wonders what we were thinking, how we responded, whether we rose to the challenge or failed it. The deep time perspective gives context, understanding, humility, but it doesn't remove agency. You still have to decide. Every day, what kind of human you want to be, what kind of society you want to live in, what kind of planet you want to leave behind. Choose well. The rocks are watching.